Now I want to introduce you to John Ellis because I'm going to do something new going forward on Fridays. John's been a guest before. He's a longtime newsman. He's the real deal. He's been doing news longer than I have, which means he's been doing news a long time. And John puts out news items every day. It's the last thing I read before I go on the air. That's why I know that Mark Carney's going to call a snap election on April 28th. John, welcome. Would you first tell people about what news items is and what service you're providing and why I rushed to invest in it when you launched it and why I use it every day?
Well, News Items is a morning newsletter. It tries to come out before 6:45 a.m. Eastern Time. The slogan of it is interesting, important, or both. So we report stories that we find interesting, important, or both. And we cover four major areas. One we call World in Disarray. The second we call the financialization of everything. The third we call advances in science and technology. And the fourth we call politics, foreign and domestic.
And the reason I find it invaluable is that there are too many news sources and I don't know who to trust. And you do that. You are now sort of the editor to the world. So what I asked John to consider doing, we're going to try it out, is on Friday in the first segment of the show for him to tell us what he thinks was the most important news of the week that's coming to a close. So, John, you have the floor. What mattered most to you this week?
Well, I thought the biggest story of the week was the not peace in Ukraine. President Putin seemed to not move 1 inch in the negotiations with President Trump. President Zelensky did pretty much what President Trump asked him to do, but it seems to have not moved the ball very much. So I thought that was important because obviously it has implications across Europe and indeed across the world.
This morning's newsletter included, by the way, a lot of details about reciprocal attacks on each other country's energy infrastructure. So clearly there's no ceasefire.
No ceasefire, no. In fact, after the call between Trump and Putin, within 3 hours, Russia launched a major assault on Ukrainian energy facilities in numerous cities. So it was a short peace, let's put it that way.
What is story number 2?
Well, the story number 2 is related, which is the Chinese had a Chinese had a D-Day style test in which they tested these barges, which was practice for an amphibious landing in the South China Sea, and everybody saw it as a sort of a practice for perhaps invading Taiwan. It was staged, appropriately at the time of the non-peace in Ukraine, and it's the Trump administration is probably 90% focused on China and Taiwan, and this was a story that supported the view that they should be mostly focused on what's going on in China and
Secretary
Taiwan.
Rubio was my guest yesterday, and he said the story of the 21st century will be the story of the United States' relationship with China. I agree with that, but I also think we're probably going to end up in a war. Certainly we're in a Cold War right now and lurching kind of towards a hot war. What do you think, John?
Oh, I think we're definitely in a Cold War. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I do think that China is having severe difficulties with its economy, and that exporting their excess capacity, all that steel they make, all that cement they make, all of the cars, so forth, and war is not good for that. So if there's something that constrains it, it's probably, economic slowdown, economic non-performance, whatever you want to call it. That said, there's, the Chinese government and President Xi have been fairly explicit in their desire, to, quote, repatriate, end quote, Taiwan, and also to spread China's sphere of influence. So it comes down, it seems to me, to Taiwan. If China invades Taiwan, right now we have a policy of strategic ambiguity, meaning if China attacks, maybe we'll come to Taiwan's defense and maybe we won't. It's strategically ambiguous, and so don't try it. There are a lot of people calling for, I think there are a lot of the Trump administration who are for strategic certainty, which is to say, if China does invade Taiwan or blockade Taiwan, that the U.S. will definitely get involved. The that's sort of the crux of the matter. Is it strategic ambiguity or is it strategic certainty? I don't think the Trump administration has come to a final conclusion on that, but there's certainly a lot of people in the administration who believe that strategic certainty is the way to go.
Now, John Ellis, one of the reasons I love news items is that you do tell me about the Chinese economy, and that is not often covered everywhere. It's really struggling. It's struggling on a lot of different fronts in its real estate sector, in its export sector, in its demographic future. Does Wall Street price that in very well? Do they have enough transparency into what's going on in China to be able to price China correctly?
I think it's hard, but I think they're certainly not great believers in the official numbers. Let's put it that way. I think that I think the markets, quote unquote, believe that China worked their way out of the crisis. Larger problem is, Chinese men and women aren't getting married. They seem to have lost a lot of confidence in the future. There seems to be a lot of confidence in the regime. They're hard to get for people coming from rural and ex-urban communities. Local tax revenues are down. I mean, indicator after indicator, and a economy, as we know, leads to political instability, which in the case of communist China means ever harder, ever harsher crackdowns. Given all that, I'm not sure that Wall Street can be fully confident of what they see, but I don't think unless they're on the inside, sure they can be.
What
Clearly,
about the third story? Let's move on to story number 3 in the news items world.
The third story to me was pointed out by Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, and a sort of an understudy to Bob Rubin when he was the Secretary of the Treasury. And he pointed out in an interview with Bloomberg that the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell had his briefing and they put out their statement. They kept the rates steady, and Powell said nice words about the economy holding up and so on and so forth. But within that, it turned out that the Fed had slashed its cap for how much in treasuries it let rolls off its balance sheet in a month to $5 billion from $25 billion. So the phrase for this is quantitative tightening, in which the Fed gets, pairs off the debt that they've been carrying since the financial crisis and the pandemic, and they've been trying to offload this debt for some time, and the rolling average, if you will, was 25 billion per month. And this time it was 5 billion, which indicates that the Fed is a lot less confident in the economy than they let on.
Stand by for a second. I'm coming back with John Ellis during the break. It'll also be on the weekend, the big weekend pod, so do not miss that. John Ellis, Ellis Items, just go and subscribe if you want an actual fair broker of what is real news. You can trust news items. Stay tuned. I'm Hugh Hewitt. So I'm back with John Ellis, editor-in-chief of News Items. John, what did you make Larry Summer to be saying about what the Fed chair, Mr. Powell, was not saying? I mean, what are the winks and the nods and the clues adding up to?
Well, if you're feeling confident about the economy and the growth of the economy, then you would, in theory, move this Treasury debt to the private market at the sort of announced rate of 25 billion per. That suddenly was changed to 5 billion per, and the way Mr. Summers interpreted that is that given that Powell gave no indication that quantitative tightening would decline, if you will, that indicates some lack of confidence in where the economy is going, and that's not that it doesn't contradict what he said in the press conference, but it adds context. And if the Fed is looking at it more skeptically than perhaps they let on, that's worth noting.
Worrisome stuff. John Ellis, thank you so much. Thank you for news items. It keeps me going every single morning, and I recommend it to everyone out there who's listening to the Weekend Pod or to the Hugh Hewitt Show. If you want to know what the news is, we live in a meteor strike a minute of news, and you just got to know what's real and what's AI generated, CGI, fabricated news. John does that for you. Thank you, John Ellis.